Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine war and US elections breaking news special. We have heard that RFK Jr, the third party in the presidential election with, running alongside Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, has dropped out. Now, although he was losing popularity, he was under both. I think you've got Walz, Harris, who are both above zero in the favorability ratings, which is your net favorability, unfavorability. You had Walz, Harris, and then RFK Jr., then Trump, then Vance. That's how the polls are looking for favorability. He is still not greatly popular more among younger voters and conspiracy theorists, but he's dropped out. The question is, where are his votes going to go? And we can see that third-party voters are unpredictable is the idea. He was popular among Hispanic voters, actually, interestingly. But yeah, lost a big chunk of his support. We'll see where the polls suggest his votes will go. Just 1% of Democrats have said they are voting for RFK Jr. in a YouGov poll, compared to 3% for Republicans. So originally, it was thought that RFK Jr. was splitting the vote, but actually taking more of the Democrats away due to war on Gaza and other sort of young, more topics that skewed to the younger generation in terms of what they found important. And so when they were getting upset with, for example, Gaza and other things, they were moving more from the Democrats to RFK Jr. But what actually I think started happening was RFK Jr. started becoming more like Trump and was being this Trumpian alternative. And what you started seeing were people who were getting a little bit disenchanted with Trump moving to the natural alternative that was RFK Jr. And therefore, RFK Jr. started taking more away from Trump. And that's when there were sort of movements, suggestions that, different things were afoot. And in the end, RFK Jr. went, I think, to both candidates, both nominees, and said, look, if I ditch this, throw the towel in and endorse you, will you give me a job in your administration? And Kamala Harris and her team went, nah. And Trump may well have said yes. And so he's throwing his endorsement behind Trump. But the polls have been unable to clearly dictate whether more Biden or Trump 2020 voters have come out in support of Kennedy, with polls showing a mix of both. On average, various polls, says The Independent, have shown that there is a little to no change when Harris and Trump compete in a head-to-head without third-party candidates. But where there is a minimal boost, it tends to lean in favour of Trump by plus 1 or 2 points, not the other way around. Going to a third-party candidate most often means that the voter is disillusioned with the current choices or situation. So it's difficult to say whether these same voters will go back to their previous party allegiances or in fact be more likely to vote to do the opposite. In other words, for example, if slightly more voters are leaving Trump's GOP and moving to RFK Jr. because they're disenchanted with Trump, they're still going to be disenchanted with Trump. So do they then just write another name in the ballot, don't vote, or do they go to Democrats, or do they go back to Trump? So this is why the subsection to this article is third-party voters are unpredictable. You can't just assume they're going to go back to their original allegiance. So it's going to be very difficult to see how this will affect the polls. Might initially suggest one thing or another, but I think until the polls sort of calm down, maybe in a month's time, until that happens, we won't get a proper understanding of how this might affect the election. Now, this is where we go on to the Ukraine stuff, because the reasons he has given for dropping out are very clear. He elucidates them rather clearly.
And now, to throw my support to President
Or not.
Trump, the causes were free speech, a war in Ukraine, and the war on our children.
Free speech, war in Ukraine, and a war on our children. It's probably a bit of a misnomer for me to say he said that very clearly. Right, so He then gives a bit of an explanation for his dislike for the present administration's approach to Ukraine. And unfortunately, it is the old blame NATO and so on and so forth.
I want to say a word about the Ukraine war. The military-industrial complex has provided us with a familiar comic book justification, like they do on every war, that this one is a noble effort to stop a supervillain, Vladimir Putin, from invading the Ukraine and then to thwart his Hitler-like march across Europe. In fact, tiny Ukraine is a proxy in a geopolitical struggle initiated by the ambitions of the U.S. neocons for American global hegemony. I'm not excusing Putin for invading Ukraine. He had other options. But the war is Russia's predictable response to the reckless neocon project of extending NATO to encircle Russia, a hostile act.
In other words, it's the US's fault, it's NATO's fault. It's the US neocons and NATO going through expansionism, and it's a predictable result of Russia. I'm not excusing Putin, he says, and then literally excuses Putin. And this kind of, not even appeasement, this moral mitigation of Putin's intentions and actions is, I think, egregious. I have absolutely no time for this, and we've had these arguments before. I'm not going to rerun the arguments, but NATO expansionism is not why Putin invaded in 2014 with the little green men. It was nothing to do with NATO. And then the later invasion in 2022 was just an extension of 2014, but then after the fact added on things like NATO expansionism. And that clearly wasn't what was going on in 2014, so it wasn't what was going on in 2022. It's about Crimea. It's about this essential view where I mean, like, the essence of Russia having Ukraine as part of it. It's this kind of historical cherry picking. It's Putin wanting to be Peter the Great again, so on and so forth. Like, I can give you all the proper reasons why Putin invaded Ukraine, and it wasn't NATO expansionism. So I have a real issue with RFK Jr. sucking in this Putin narrative here. I have no time for RFK Jr. myself, to be honest. He is just full of conspiracy theory nonsense and wingnut views on geopolitical issues like the war in Ukraine. And it's too easy to blame US imperialism and neocons. Yes, there are moments in history where US neocons and US imperialism have been an issue, right? Just not with this one. He talks about comic book justification. No, his is a comic book caricature of what is really going on. So I thought it was important to let you know that this has happened in case you have your head in the sand, but also to look briefly at least one of the three main reasons he has given for throwing in the towel and endorsing Trump. And what this tells you is that he has a full and proper understanding that Trump also thinks it's NATO expansionism, and Trump has even given you that rationale before. He has used rhetoric to blame NATO before. And this tells you that it's understood in political circles who will be a greater support for Ukraine. The Democrats or the Republicans. It's the Democrats. Here we have an appeaser throwing the towel in and saying, I'm putting my lot with Trump because he aligns much more with my sense of free speech, of who's at fault for Ukraine, and war on children, vaccinations, and so on and so forth. So anyway, that's what's happened. Let me know what you think in the comments below. It is, unfortunately, the decision was heavily influenced by geopolitical issues in Ukraine, just not ones that are particularly connected to reality. Toodle pips.